Iraq, 15 years after the fall of Saddam Hussein, a concerning development in Brazil, and our first ever interview with expert commentary on the riots in Paris. I'm Chuck Holton, and this is The Hot Zone.
This is The Hot Zone. Engaging with the news in a whole new way, international war correspondent Chuck Holton brings insight into areas of crisis and lets you help those affected.
Hi folks, I hope you had a great weekend. Today let's start by talking about Iraq. 15 years ago, last week, operators from the U.S. Army Delta Force pulled Saddam Hussein out of a hole in the ground at a remote farm near his hometown of Tikrit. His disheveled mugshot went viral within hours, and it was a major victory in the U.S.-led campaign to put an end to the terror-supporting regime. The United States has expended a whole lot of blood and treasure in Iraq since that historic day, and we've still got about 6,000 U.S. servicemen on the ground there right now. No one could have imagined the profound effect that the war would have on America and the rest of the world. It's become a part of America's longest war. Many people don't realize that. American soldiers, sailors, airmen, guardsmen, and Marines have often spent more time at war than any U.S. troops in U.S. history. World War II, World War I, doesn't matter. I know guys who have 10 and 12 deployments under their belts. I myself have made more than 20 trips to Iraq and Afghanistan covering the war. Now, many who served at the beginning of the conflict are watching their sons and daughters get deployed to the same places they themselves once served, I myself included. Iraq is slowly pulling itself out of the morass of sectarian division, but this will be a generations-long process, one that can't be completed by the U.S. military. If there's anything we've learned in the last 15 years, it's that the American war machine is the most efficient, lethal, and devastating force ever seen on this planet at taking out a well-defined enemy. But wherever we attempt to turn those warriors into policemen or diplomats, we fail pretty bad. And that's why I've come to the opinion that our foreign policy should be this. If you present a threat to the United States of America, we will quickly and efficiently reboot your country for you by taking out your leaders and giving you a clean slate. Then, as quickly as we came, we'll leave, and we'll let you rebuild your country any way you want. At the moment, we decide that you've once again become a threat, we'll rain fire on you again and let you keep trying until you get it right. See, the Marines have a motto: no better friend, no worse enemy. That's about as perfect a foreign policy statement as I've ever heard. Rather than spending trillions of the people's treasure to try and create a Jeffersonian democracy in a place that hasn't figured out how to use toilets yet, opening ourselves up to incredible attrition and feeding the corruption that's endemic to places like Iraq and Afghanistan, it would just be smarter to take out the people who threaten us with extreme speed and surprise and violence of action, and then leave them to put the pieces back together however they like. That's just my opinion. Iraq today is still gripped by sectarian strife and the lingering evil of ISIS, but according to my sources on the ground there, things are improving little by little. The biggest threat today is the power struggle taking place in the north between Turkey and the Kurdish Peshmerga, the Iranian-controlled provisional military units, Russia, and the United States, because everyone wants to control what happens now with Mosul and on up into Syria. So the violence will likely continue there for some time. Now let's move on to Brazil. There are a ton of things we could talk about there, but we don't have time today to go into it all. But right now, I just want to point out something you might have missed in the news last week. There was a church shooting in Brazil this week in which a gunman walked into a cathedral in the central city of Campinas and opened fire during a mass. 5 were killed and several others wounded before the gunman turned the gun on himself. Now, this is concerning for several reasons. First of all, because it's the first time we've seen a random mass shooting in Brazil. And secondly, it appears that the wall-to-wall media coverage of mass homicides like this is causing events to spread like this around the world. It also shows that the phenomenon of mass shootings is not unique to the United States, although we regularly hear politicians say things like this.
We as a country will have to reckon with the fact that this type of mass violence does not happen in other advanced countries. It doesn't happen in other places with this kind of frequency.
The reality, however, says different. In a recent report from the Crime Prevention Research Center, America ranks 12th among Western countries for mass shootings per capita and 11th for death rate per capita by mass public shootings. Important to understand about the shooting in Brazil is that country currently has in place all of the so-called common sense gun regulations that are being called for by many politicians in the United States. There's a whole lot more to Brazil that we'll have to get to another time, but because right now I want to go back to the ongoing unrest in France as violent yellow vest protests continued to rock Paris over the weekend and other cities across that country as well. I recently spoke to an expert on this subject, Chuck DeVore from the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and he had so much great stuff to share. I'm just going to play the entire interview for you right now. Let's talk a little bit about your article in Forbes about the riots in Paris. I found it very interesting how you linked the riots to the climate change debate in the United States. Give me a little overview of your points in that article.
Right. So gasoline in France is a little over $7 a gallon, and almost half of that is taxes. And what many people think set off the recent unrest in France was the pending 25 cent a gallon gas tax hike for gasoline, 10 cents for diesel. Although this wasn't for general revenue, this was in fact to fight climate change. And a lot of the protesters felt squeezed. They were the working poor, the middle class. They don't earn enough money for them for fuel to be, kind of an irrelevant cost. But on the other hand, they're not the recent immigrants, many from the Middle East and North Africa, who get government assistance. So they kind of felt left out in the cold, and they let their displeasure be known.
So how does this, what we're seeing in Paris now, have anything to do with the migration that happened and has been happening into Europe and has really started to change the culture completely?
Well, certainly in France, you've seen that for a while because, of course, in France, a lot of the migration came from former French colonies in Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia, with the more recent immigration being kind of a more of a sudden phenomena that perhaps sharpened concerns of individuals in Europe that they were just getting a raw deal, that they were being taken for granted. And so I think that these tax hikes that have been since postponed or delayed, and now, of course, President Macron of France has announced an increase to the minimum wage, equivalent to a little over $1 an hour equivalent, to kind of appease the protesters. I think, though, the interesting lesson learned for Americans, and specifically for the progressives and liberals that really believe in higher taxes to fight climate change, the lesson learned here is pretty clear. Don't be direct and transparent about it. You want to hide it. You don't want a direct tax. That might lead to electoral losses, probably won't lead to the sort of violent unrest that we've seen in France, but it would probably lead to losses at the ballot box, which they don't want. And so the lesson is very clear. And you see that with the Green New Deal that's being proposed, for example, by Representative-elect Ocasio-Cortez, where she's proposing significant subsidies and regulations and rules that would make energy more costly. It would make it more costly to drive. You just wouldn't see it in a tax bill. It would be obscured rather than transparent.
Now, you point out in your article that this is all based on a climate change study that really is being pushed through lies of omission and lies of commission. What do you mean by that?
Well, you have the National Climate Assessment that many on the left criticized the Trump administration for releasing the day after Thanksgiving to try to bury it. And that National Climate Assessment is a compendium of many different studies that they kind of built up to create the overarching study. And one study in particular got a lot of notice with the New York Times and CNN and other outlets. And this study basically said that we were going to see a 10% hit to the economy and thousands of people were going to die because of climate change. Well, what they didn't mention were a few very important facts. First of all, who funded the study? Well, Michael Bloomberg and Tom Steyer, two billionaire left-wing environmental activists, funded the study, along with the federal government, unfortunately. That's number one. Number two, who wrote the study? Well, out of the 12 authors, at least 4 of the authors contributed 44 times to left-wing and progressive causes at the federal level. Of course, none to any conservative or non-liberal causes. Mm-hmm. And one author in particular is very problematic, Professor James Rising out of UC Berkeley. His blog has some pretty incredible statements. You know, he traffics in conspiracy theories about the Bush family, that they bought property in Paraguay to escape the International Criminal Court and to flee to when the U.S. government fell. He talks about eliminating President Trump. He equates religious extremism in America with a religious extremism in the Middle East, which is quite a grossly offensive thing to say, because what he's saying is that people of faith in America that take their faith seriously are the moral equivalent of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. That's a pretty out there thing to say, and he's one of the 4 prime authors of this report, Professor James Rising of Berkeley. So that's another problematic thing. But then you get into the details of the report. How did they arrive at this 10% hit to the economy? Well, first of all, they take the worst case and least likely climate scenario, which is that by 2100, so basically 80 years from now, that our climate in America would be 14 degrees Fahrenheit hotter. And the UN says that this is very unlikely, and it's the worst case scenario. That's number one. Number two, 2/3 of the 10% in economic damages, 2/3 come from premature heat deaths. Now, this is unreasonable because it assumes that people will die in droves from heat waves. That's not how this happens. In fact, if you look at countries that are much hotter than America and even hotter than what's being projected in this worst case scenario, their mortality rates are no different than ours because people adjust. They buy air conditioning, they change their work schedules so they don't work in the hot sun. So it's not as if you're going to see this sort of a problem. The last thing, of course, that they fail to mention is that this 10% hit to the economy assumes no new technology, and it comes on top of an economy that's projected to be more than 3 times larger than it is today. So that's where this alarmist, concern came from. Yeah. And of course, that's being used by the media and by the left to justify the complete takeover of our economy in the service of fighting climate change. That's where the impetus for this Green New Deal comes from.
Mm-hmm. Well, Chuck, I really appreciate it. You are very well spoken, and I certainly appreciate your research on this. It's very, very good to hear from you, and I hope we can have you on again sometime. Thank you very much. You know, I've conducted hundreds of interviews over the past 15 years, and I've got to say, Chuck is one of the most well-spoken and competent people I've ever had the pleasure of speaking with. I highly recommend you go read any of his books and his really insightful articles, which are published in Forbes magazine and elsewhere. Well, that's all we have time for today. Thank you for your support, and please let us hear from you. You can find me at the Hot Zone Podcast on Facebook, hotzoneholton@gmail.com, or please give us a like and a follow wherever you happen to listen to this, on iTunes, YouTube, or Podbean. If you'd like to support the podcast, go to patreon.com/hotzone and become a subscriber. Have a great day, and we'll see you back here tomorrow on The Hot Zone.
The Hot Zone is produced by Amy Holton and Livefire Media. Copyright 2019.